Okay, so today I was going to show you about mixing and mastering. I've been asked this question on one of my other YouTube videos. Please do subscribe and you can see loads of other demos and music and other things. So I'm actually going to do the entire process today. I'm going to record just 8 bars so that this video doesn't end up being 6 hours long. And then I'm going to show you how I would go about mixing. Now, first of all, drums. Now, what I've got is I've got 4 mics on the drums. So I'm going to use my other camera here just to show you where they are. So we've got a kick drum mic down there. We've got a snare drum mic here, which is pointing at the center point of your snare. And then I've got these 2 overheads here, which are looking at 90 degrees to each other over the drum kit. So what I've done is I've plugged those in to my mixing desk down here. And I'm going to record onto the computer and the computer there and my hard disk machine at the same time. Now the reason that I'm doing this is that you can do a lot with your computer. With Logic, you can put compression on channels, you can do lots of EQing, you can do that sort of thing. I'm actually going to mix in 2 ways today, so you can see the old way and the new way. Well, new way being about 20 years old now. But it helps to look at the old way to know how the new way works. And it's quite important this. Anyone under 30 won't have used a mixing desk and a dedicated recorder unless they've been assisting in a studio or now producers or whatever. So you need to know where signals have gone and where they're going to and how you do your mixing and EQing and reverbs and compression. So bass and snare drum are actually going through a compressor here. 2 sides of a compressor, and they've gone through this preamp here. So if I hit the snare, hopefully you shall see the right hand VU there moving, and the bass drum is on that one. At the same time, those mic channels will also be going to the computer, but without going through the compressor. So that's how I'm going to do this. I'm going to record the drums uncompressed onto the computer and compressed onto the hard disk record. Okay, so I'm now set up ready to record. So my kick drum and snare drum are the only ones that I've compressed. The overheads I have not. Now, why do we use compression on the way in? Well, it stops, for example, the recording level going too high, but that's really a secondary thing, because actually you want the kick drum and the snare drum to be quite strong in the mix. The more compressed they are, the more you can push them up, because it's clip the peaks off, which means that you can have the bass drum and the snare drum really strong and really consistent. There is, however, a downside. You don't want to over compress, otherwise you'll have no dynamics at all. And you can get that sort of horrible pumping effect. So if I just briefly show you the compressor on here, you will see that the snare drum, for example, has only been reduced by about 3 dB. And the same thing for the bass drum. So I've just taken the edge off. Okay, so there we go. Now it's gone on to the hard disk machine, which says please wait while the hard drive is rendering everything and the computer's just doing its processing. It's important to leave those things in in place until you're ready to go. Now, I'm going to put some bass down next, so I've got to do a little bit of preliminary mixing before I can put the bass down so that I am happy with what I'm hearing. You have to make sure that you're utterly happy with your mix before you continue recording. Notice how important it is at the end of your recording to be as silent as you can, none of that sort of stuff. So if you're silent at the end and silent at the beginning, it's a piece of cake to mix and master because you haven't got anything to worry about. So now it's the turn of the bass. I've got my bass plugged into the preamp that the snare drum was in. There we go, you can see the meter moving. And it's also going into the compressor from that preamp. The meter on the left there, which is going sort of right to left, is the amount that it's reducing the level by. If I'm plucking the loudest notes, you can see that there are more lights showing. But it'll still allow me the dynamic to play quietly. So if you look on the meter on the right hand side, it remains quite constant, even when there's lots of level in there. So that's going into my hard disk machine. It's also going onto the computer there, as you can see. So I'm going to listen to the output of this machine, but the hard disk recorder is controlling the laptop via MIDI timecode so that actually I'm able to record onto both things at once. This is just purely for this demonstration. So okay, so there's my bass part. Now with guitar, I've got a guitar amp here, a small guitar amp that's running at only 3 watts, so it's perfect for studio use. You can have it quite loud, and what happens with a guitar amp is that it delivers natural compression at that sort of power level. So that means I don't need to put it through my compressor. If I look at the level meter, you can see that number 14 is enabled, track 14. The level going to it doesn't change a great deal because the amp is compressing. Now, I've also set up the guitar to run through what's called a DI box. You can have a look at one of my other videos to see about that, about what it's for. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to record 2 channels to the computer. I'm going to record the guitar just going into the machine and the guitar going through this. Now the reason I'm doing that is that maybe afterwards on the computer I may want to change my guitar sound. What they used to have to do was to send a track from the multi-track back into the studio and play the guitar track back through another amplifier and then record the mic output, record with a mic that guitar amp's sound. So there was quite a lot of hassle involved. So it's good to try and get your guitar sound sorted before you start. That doesn't mean that it's always going to work though. So, you know, we are in uncharted waters really. So on the computer, you'll be hearing the dry guitar signal as well, and you can use a guitar amp simulator that's built into Logic or Cubase or whatever. So I'm going to record that guitar part. Here we go. So I'm going to stick a bit of keyboard on next, just a sound to try and fill out that harmony of that tune, and it just helps with the mix as well. It helps join everything together. So that's my next job. I'm going to record this to my hard disk and to the computer as well. It's quite a paddy sort of sound that I'm going to use, so once again, compression, I'm going to leave that. Now this keyboard is a Yamaha YC45D, a very nice classic keyboard from 1973 with some very nice sounds on it. So it's now time for some vocals. I've got my vocal mic set up here with this thing. It's a pop shield. Now you put that in front of the mic, because if I go, you can hear that noise, and it gets rid of it. Now one thing that we do have to do is when we play back, we're going to have to be careful of the bass response of everything that we're looking at, except for the bass drum and the bass guitar. We're going through the compressor again. Billie Jean is not my lover. You can see that that compressor has rolled things off a bit, but I'm also going to the computer with no compression. So same as before with the bass drum, the snare drum, bass guitar. She was born like a beauty queen from a movie scene. I said, don't mind, but what do you mean? I am the one who will dance on the floor in a round. She said, I am the one who will dance on the floor in a round. People always tell me, be careful what you do. Don't go around breaking young girls' hearts. Mother always told me, be careful your love. Be careful what you do, because a lie becomes the truth. Billie Jean is not my lover. Okay, so there we go. Now I've got all 8 tracks down, I can start mixing this thing. So now we've finished recording, now's the time to play it back and have a go at a bit of mixing. And I'm going to start with the old way first that I referred to earlier. That is the non-computer. So this is a hard disk recorder, but it's a dedicated recorder, so it only stores audio. It doesn't do any of the flashy stuff that Logic can do. However, what we do is we plug this into the mixing desk so that we can listen to all of the individual tracks and do a bit of a mix with some reverbs and all sorts of things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with all the tracks down here, so that they're all off. I'm going to find my initial position, and when I press play, you'll hear all the instruments, all the individual things coming in one by one. Now those are my drums. The overheads come in on faders 3 and 4, so I'm going to twist those to left and right respectively, so we get that nice stereo spread that the mics captured earlier. And then I'm going to add all the other things like my bass, and I've got a guitar and keyboards and vocals. And let's just drag the faders up, see what we've got. Okay, it's a start. Now, as with computer recording or any recording, you should cut the low end, that is the very low bass, off anything that is not a bass instrument. So kick drum and bass guitar are my only two legitimate bass sounds there. So that means the snare, I'm going to cut a little bit of bass off here. Now I'm using EQ on the desk here, which is a good old-fashioned bass and treble cut or boost. So I'm just going to take the bass off that and make sure I've kept the bass guitar up there. Guitar, I don't want to cut too much bass that I lose the body of the instrument. Keyboards, bit of bass off, and then the vocals, bit of bass there as well, bit of bass cut. So I'm going to just quickly play back the individual instruments now. Now we have a solo function here, which I can listen to various things on. Now the way I've got this demo wired at the moment, the solo function won't actually work on this desk with the recording, but I can just play you back the bass on its own, for example, by doing this. There's a little red light on the desk here which says that the level coming from here is a little bit too high. Luckily there's an input control which allows me to just take that back a bit. Let's just try that. That'll do. So I'm going to put the bass drum and the bass guitar together so that I can look at mixing the low end. I really want those two instruments to firm up the bass because there's nothing else, no other bass instruments there. So the bass drum and the bass guitar are working together okay there. So I'm going to add the rest of my drums and just see what happens with the bass. Yeah, I think that's okay. Now I'm going to add the vocals next, because actually the vocals are the most important part of the song in terms of delivering the top line and everything. So I've got to make sure that they sit above the bass and the drums. She was born like a beauty queen from a movie scene. I said don't mind, but what do you mean? I am the one who will dance on the floor in a round. Now you can hear a little bit of reverb on that. I'm using some old reverb units that I've got in the rack here, and I've got a control on the desk here that sends each individual track to a reverb unit, and it comes back on this fader here. So if I go really over top with the reverb, she said I am the one. And as you can hear, the snare is also feeding that. I'm going to take the snare reverb off, simply because a snare, the way a snare works, is the little metal gauze on the underside of that drum, which is the snare, actually is kind of a reverb for the drum anyway. You hit the drum and the is kind of a natural decay. So I'm a bit of a fan of dry drums, but you can add reverb if you like. Who will dance on the floor in a round. Now that reverb is way over the top, so I'm going to halve that. Tell me, be careful what you do. Don't go around breaking young girls' hearts. Now, it is nice to have reverb on the vocals, not only for the space, but also for the stereo imaging of what the reverb does to that mono signal, so that I can hear it above the entire mix. I'm going to add the guitar and the keyboards next, and we'll just see if that all works together. She was born like a beauty queen from a movie scene. I said don't mind, but what do you mean? I am the one who will dance on the floor in a round. She said I am the one. Okay. Now, over here on the rack, we have got a stereo compressor. And this piece of kit essentially takes my output level of the desk and it'll either squash it or just limit it slightly. At the moment it's set to bypass. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the mix back and you'll be able to hear the effect that this has on the overall mix.
She was born like a beauty queen from a movie scene. I said, don't mind, but what do you mean? I am the one who would dance on the floor.
So that has quite a pronounced effect. One effect that it does have is that it brings the reverb up, actually. Because the reverb is a low signal, what a compressor does is it brings the top levels down, the loudest bits, and then you have a gain control which brings everything else, which brings everything back up, so that you get a narrower band of dynamics, and that is what is happening here. I'm bringing the reverb up, which is the low level signal. So you've got to be a little bit careful with this. Now this is kind of how you might begin to master an analog recording, an analog playback, that is the machine coming out of the desk. So I'm just going to play it again and just knock the very, very loudest bits off.
And around. She said, I am the one who will dance on the floor and around. People always tell me, be careful what you do. Don't go around breaking young girls' hearts. Mother always told me, be careful your love. Be careful what you do, because a lie becomes the truth. Billie Jean is not my lover.
There we go. That is an introduction to the analog way, the old way. Now we're going to do the new way, so I'm going to bring the computer back and we'll have a listen to that. Okay, so we've seen how we can do a little bit of mixing using the multi-track machine here and the mixing desk in conjunction with some old reverb units, and you can hear you can get a pretty good result. However, you can't, if you're going to do another job, you'd have to remember all your fader positions, you have to write them down. With Logic or computer-based systems, it's much easier. So let's close all these faders down now. So that's my multi-track mix. That's done and dusted. And this time I'm going to bring up just the 2 channels of my computer. So hopefully now when I press play,
Do you mean I am?
I'm listening to the vocals of their own. So we've got the computer showing here. I'm just going to close the scale down so that you can see that my tracks are all laid out one above the other. You've got drums, kicks, snare, overheads, the bass guitar, a guitar amp with a guitar DI, and then we've got things like the vocals and the keyboards there. Now, it's always a good idea with a computer to name your tracks. Always name your track. Vocal compressed, vocal uncompressed. Okay. So now I'm going to go through this. I'm just going to have a little listen. All the faders by default on Logic are at 0 on your mixer, with all the pan controls, that is left or right, in the middle. So there we are. There's the beginning of it. So I'm now going to have a little listen. I'm just going to do this on the headphones because I've got the narration mic up here as well. So let's have a look. So the guitar is quite high at the moment. Now, part of the reason for that is that we are listening to 2 guitar tracks. If I just solo out the guitar amp, that's the amplifier over here. And if I listen to the other one, that is the guitar as it went dry into the computer, which means that I could, if I wanted to, put a guitar amp on it. For the moment, I'm going to just mute that track, and I'm also going to mute the vocal uncompressed track. Sorry, the compressed track, leaving the uncompressed one. Now you can hear that the vocal is very low indeed. Now, if you've got a very, very low level on Logic or whatever, you can actually bring the gain right up by either putting the gain up as a plug-in, or you could actually adjust the file. I'm going to just do a plug-in for the minute. It's going to bring it up 12 dB, see how that works. Getting better. Now, dB scale. 6 dB is a doubling of level. So 12 dB would be a quadrupling, it's double. So if you go the other way, 6 dB down is half the level, 12 dB down is a quarter. Once again, your ears are the judge of what your eyes see. So if there is something that's not quite right, it might sound okay. If it sounds okay, leave it. Okay, so I'm going to put the vocals now through a compressor. So this is a software version of the hardware compressors that we've been using up till now. Who will dance on the floor in a round? Now with this display up here, you can see that the compressor display has a meter on it, which shows how much it's having to reduce that vocal level by. Do you mean I am the one who will dance on the floor in a round? That's starting to sound a bit better now. So with all of the tracks here, we have level controls, we have EQ, and you have plugins on every channel. That's something you don't get on a conventional analog mixing desk. So I'm just going to get started with the drums on their own, because the kick drum and the snare drum are uncompressed. So let's have a listen. I've just gone into my mixer panel here. I'm just going to listen to the drums on their own. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pan the overheads left and right. Now I'm just going to make sure that my pan controls are set properly there. There we go. So if I cut one of the channels, it'll only be coming out the right hand side. There we go. Now I need to make that snare drum a little bit more beefy. Now at the moment I'm soloing tracks. Ideally, if you're fiddling with anything, try and do it in context rather than soloed. Because if you solo something out and work for ages on it, bring it back into the mix and it doesn't work, you've kind of wasted your time a little bit. So I'm just going to put a very, very gentle compressor on that kick drum. Really gentle compressor, nothing too draconian. Right, EQ pane. We have a little graph here that shows you essentially bass, middle and treble. So I'm going to just bring up the bass a little bit on that bass drum. Now the frequency at which you boost or cut for bass depends on the drum, depends on the drummer, depends on the mic, depends on a lot of things. So but as a rule of thumb, the 80 Hertz boost that you've got here is about right for a kick drum. Now that's up 6 dB. That's quite a lot, but we're not going to worry about that too much. I'm going to put everything back into context and then see if that, in fact I'm going to add the bass first. Now that bass is quite nasy. It's a good old Fender Precision. It's just all lots of middle and yeah, lovely. So I'm going to actually add a little bit of depth to that bass. Now I'm going to come slightly away from the bass drum. But everything needs to occupy its own space in the frequency domain. So kick drum, maybe bass guitar above that, then guitars and keyboards and vocals. Everything has to occupy its space. You don't want two things vying for the same.
you do. Don't go around breaking young girls' hearts.
Now, I don't like that vocal at all. Partly because the frequency imbalance, I must have had something set here on the way in, on the EQ on the desk. So we've got to try and correct that. In a way, it's a good thing that we're having to do that, because it involves a little bit of fiddling about. So,
Mother always told me, be careful who you love, be careful what you do, because a lie becomes a truth. Billie Jean is not my lover.
that's not too bad.
Dance on the floor, in a round.
Now, my particular vocal style is quite nasally. So I should get singing lessons, really.
One who will dance on the floor, in a round.
Now, with that, I'm going to cut everything below about 100 hertz. 100 hertz is a good rule of thumb when you're cutting bass off tracks that don't require bass. So I'm going to just...
She said, I am the one.
I'm going to cut 100 hertz off that guitar amp as well. Okay. And you can hear a helicopter going overhead on the narration mic. So, let's have a little listen to that.
Dance on the floor, in a round. She said, I am the one.
I want a little bit of treble on that guitar to make it a bit spiky.
She said, I am the one who will dance on the floor, in a round.
There you go, that's a bit brighter now.
Go around breaking young girls' hearts. Mother always told me, be careful who you love, be careful.
Keyboards are quite low in general. I'm just going to put the gain up of this. Now, if you were really going to make sure that you got the recording absolutely right, you would make sure that you had a healthy level whichever tracks you're recording on. Part of the reason why some things are a little bit amiss is because I recorded to this and this, and I had to satisfy both machines. So it's slightly tricky doing that.
Careful who you love, be careful what you do, because a lie becomes a truth. Billie Jean is...
Okay, so I've got some sort of semblance of level out of most of the tracks now. So I'm just going to have a listen from the beginning, and I'm going to play this through one last time, and I'm going to make small adjustments as I go through.
She was born like a beauty queen from a movie scene. I said, don't mind, but what do you mean? I am the one who will dance on the floor, in a round. She said, I am the one who will dance on the floor, in a round.
So the snare drum wants a bit of a waking up. So I'm just going to put a compressor on that, just to make sure we can make that cut through the mix.
One who will dance on the floor, in a round. She said, I am the one who will dance on the floor, in a round. People always tell me, be careful what you do. Don't go around breaking young girls' hearts. Mother always told me.
So I just cut a little bit of the nasally content from the bass as well. So I've brought the snare up, I've brought the overheads down slightly. The overheads are designed just to get the cymbals, the hi-hats, the toms, etc. So I want to be a little bit careful cutting too much bass off those for the sake of those toms.
Go around breaking young girls' hearts. Mother always told me, be careful who you love.
So I'm going to put a little bit of reverb on those vocals now. So I'm going to add a stereo plugin. You want reverb really to be in stereo so that you get a nice sense of where the vocals are in that stereo space, in that spread. Now it gives you usually a default of 80% dry, 20% affected or wet signal. I'm going to halve that immediately because it's can be quite much.
Dance on the floor in a round. She said, I am the one who will dance on the floor in a round.
Now, settings wise, with the compressor, I always go for a ratio of about 3:1 for vocals, 3 or 4:1. And you have to set your threshold of your compressor so it's not acting too soon. And then there's a little makeup gain the other end, which allows you to bring your level back up.
People always tell me, be careful what you do. Don't go around breaking young girls' hearts.
So I always aim for a 4 or 5 dB reduction on the loudest passages at a ratio of 3:1, and that means that I can maintain some of the dynamics in that vocal line, but it still cuts above the mix.
She was born like a beauty queen from a movie scene. I said, don't mind, but what do you mean? I am the one who will dance on the floor in a round. She said, I am the one.
So I also panned the guitar and the keyboards ever so slightly in the stereo image, just to leave a bit of space for the vocals in the middle, so that everything wasn't vying for space in the middle of your mix as well. So now, usually you would have another track on Logic 7 at any rate. In Logic 8, 9 and Pro X, the output track is automatically shown, the output of the computer. On Logic 7 you have to assign one. So I'm going to have a look at what the stereo output is doing. So this is the mastering bit. This is what you do when you want to make this track into something that you can play on iTunes or CD or whatever. So now the meter is going to show the output level overall.
Beauty queen from a movie scene.
So there's an awful lot of peaking. There's not much in the way of that sort of higher average level that you would want. Now, you have something called, I'll just get rid of this, I can't lean over that computer. So I'm going to bring up what's called a multipressor. Now what this is a multi-band compression where you can actually set the levels of each individual part of your frequency band. So you have bass, middle and treble. You can have 3 or 4 bands. I'm just going to go with the 3. So I'm just going to play the mix through and have a little fiddle with it. I'm going to start compressing the mid-range first.
She was born like a beauty queen from a movie scene. I said, don't mind, but what do you mean? I am the one who will dance on the floor in a round.
So I've just applied a little bit of compression, not much, about 1.4:1 at the moment. But what it's done is it's actually distorted the output of my computer. So I'm having to bring the overall level down. Now I can do that actually within the multiband compressor. You have a master gain, which is quite handy, so that you can actually listen to the effect of the mastering plugin without having to overload the output of the computer.
Beauty queen from a movie scene. I said, don't mind, but what do you mean? I am the one.
Now what I can do is I can put this also through a limiter, which is simply a plugin that prevents the output from going over 0 dB on my digital scale. 0 dB is the highest. Everything below that is a negative value from -90 right up to 0. So I'm going to put this limiter on now. I'm just going to put this page over here so that you can see it on the other camera.
Who will dance on the floor in a round? She said, I am the one who will dance on the floor in a round. People always tell me.
So I'm going to play this now with no compression. I'm just going to take the effects off. So I will point to the screen when that happens.
She was born like a beauty queen from a movie scene. I said, don't mind, but what do you mean?
That is with no compression at all.
I am the one
Now back in.
who will dance on the floor in a round. She said, I am the one who will dance on the floor.
What it's done is it's made everything a little bit flatter in terms of the dynamics. And what I can do is I can then bring that up, bring the dynamics, bring the compression up slightly on the mastering plugin, just to try and squash everything down a bit.
One who will dance on the floor in a round. She said, I am the one.
Now the master fader down here now is showing a much higher average level
Who will dance on the floor in a round.
in contrast to this.
One who will dance on the floor in a round.
That doesn't have much life, but this
One who will dance on the floor in a round.
has much more. That snare is really punchy now. You don't want to overdo this, especially now. This is a version of how to do a bit of mastering for your own use and for maybe for production for other people, or whether you're just sending ideas. If you want something mastered, you are better off taking it to a mastering facility, which is a professional facility where somebody with lots and lots of listening experience will listen to your music and decide where it sits in the marketplace sonically. So there is no substitute for taking it to a mastering facility, but the ideas are presented here. You compressing various frequency bands and then applying overall limiting at the end. You can also put a little bit of EQ on as well. You have very, very expensive equalizers in these mastering facilities, which allow you to select very, very narrow bands. If there's a particular fault, you can actually do something with that. Now, mastering engineers cannot fix problems with a mix. Lots of people says, "Oh, we'll fix it in the mix." Da, 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 da. Actually, you're better off fixing things at the time. Otherwise, you're in a really tight spot with it. So there is a version of how to mix and master using the computer-based software. Now, just before I ring off, there are, of course, other plugins that you can use, things like a bit of chorus on the guitar or a bit of reverb on the snare. I just put a tiny bit of reverb on the snare, but actually I like drums really dry. My own personal taste is that drums should be as dry as possible, but I'm just going to play this with a bit of reverb on the snare so you can hear it.
She was born like a beauty queen from a movie scene. I said, don't mind, but what do you mean? I am the one.
For me, that's kind of ruined that snare drum a bit. So I'm just going to play it dry.
She was born like a beauty queen from a movie scene. I said,
There we go. There is a little introduction to mixing on the computer.